You know, it really is kind of lonely being in this studio all by myself, but that's what social distancing means. It does not, however, mean that we can't have substantive conversations. We are this morning. Dr. Larry Davis is my guest. We're actually talking about COVID-19, the novel coronavirus, but from a little bit of a different perspective. We're talking about some of the systemic racism that has found us in the position we are in. I thank Dr. Davis for spending this time with us this morning. And we were talking about social distancing in a way. And we were kind of talking about some of the disparities that already existed. And one of the things I said to you was, what struck me is as I watched our school districts unravel, so to speak. First, they were closed for a week, then 2 weeks, then 3 weeks, and then all of a sudden, our districts found out they weren't going back this year. They weren't going back this school year, and in many ways, we don't know what's going to happen in the fall, so they had to go into this distance learning. Then all of a sudden, I watched the suburban districts. They made this real smooth transition because all of a sudden, those suburban districts the kids already had Chromebooks or iPads or laptops or whatever. They'd had them all year long, and they made the transition. But when I started looking at our inner city districts, some of our poorer districts outside of the area, they didn't have computers. The kids didn't have them, or there may have been one desktop computer in the house, but there were 5 kids and mom and dad, and they were all in the house. And all of a sudden we had to we're still trying to figure out how to get computers in those households, how to get internet in those households. How can we expect those kids to be able to compete?
That's right. You're right, Lynn. Yeah, well, it's an ongoing problem. I mean, again, as you and I mentioned before, you know, this pandemic just highlights the poor status of African Americans. I mean, not only I think you're right about the laptops and all, you know, that's just, we know that the inner city schools are less prepared, that we spend less money per child. That's because, again, of segregation in part, because schools get their money from property taxes, and property taxes vary by region. So some schools have more affluent people to contribute to their schools. I mean, so we know this is really one of the flaws with American education. You know, it shouldn't be that way, because depending on what my zip code is, how good my school is likely to be. I mean, not only are there not laptops, Lynn, there's not food. We have kids who have to go to school to eat, not just to learn, but to eat. So now in schools, that isn't happening in wealthier communities. But in our community, if you shut the school down, you cut off the pipeline for food for thousands of kids. So I mean, it's just the whole thing is, you know, is tied together. Yeah, and it is a problem but it'll be a problem even after the pandemic, that our children still won't have the comparable educational tools that kids have in more affluent communities. But this is nothing new. It's based on the way that we fund schools. And in schools, for example, at the present, I'm writing this thing for Encyclopedia on overview of African Americans. And basically, some of the most recent data, we're as segregated today as we were in the 60s. I mean, the Black kids really haven't been integrated in society any more than we were when we fought for these. And I sort of said in this piece that it's kind of disappointing that we find ourselves fighting battles in the 21st century that we thought we had fought and won in the 20th century. You know, the income level has been consistently 6% of what whites blacks make. We got a nickel or a dime for every dollar that white folks have. You know, we lost tremendously with the last downside in the economy. We're going to come out big losers in this economy too. So yeah, the problems you're talking about are mainly highlighted by this thing brings out, like Katrina, it brings out who the haves and have-nots are, and we're the have-nots. And unless we can find a way, you know, to better fund our schools and also, you know, better prepare the kids to go to school. Like I said, our schools aren't just places for kids to learn; they're places for kids to have food. Many of them.
To have food, to feel safe. And you've mentioned Katrina twice in our conversation. Here's what frightens me about that, I think, is at the time that Katrina happened, the whole country was up in arms like, oh my goodness, sound the alarm. Here's how people are living. How did this happen? How do we fix this? But now who talks about Katrina? And how
Yeah.
much of that situation has actually been rectified since then?
That's right. That's right. Because it hasn't been. If those levee break in New Orleans, it'll still hurt the people who were hurt before. And it's the same thing that's happening with us now. We're sort of seeing this. I know I'm sort of being more macro than perhaps some people might like to have me be, and is just sort of focus just on the school. But it's part of a larger problem. And I think if we begin to say, I'm pretty serious about this Marshall Plan idea. I mean, people have talked about it for a long time. It's also like we like reparations, essentially,
right?
Or some combination of that. But each time we have a crisis, we sort of look at that. Well, there's a flood. Well, there's a health problem. Well, the school's closed. But they're part of a larger problem with basically blacks never got the break they should have gotten coming out of slavery. And it's never been right. And we've been playing catch up, even catch up in some respects, ever since. And unless we begin to think more globally, at least in more of a macro way, what can Pittsburgh could do some things. We could do better. I think like the governor of New York's having troubles with, he needs the presidential help. But I think Pittsburghers, we could address this issue. But it is part of the whole larger issue about the status of black people in America, but also black people in Pittsburgh.
And where I think that a lot of people fall short in that understanding is without that original investment in us, in our families, in our land, and all of those things years ago, and the inability to pass that along from one generation to the next, to have it grow and strengthen in our families, without ever having that, we find ourselves now in 2020. There's never been anything to pass along. There's never been the stability, the confidence, and all those things that grow over time, so you don't have any of that.
That's exactly right. Again, I'm on this segregation, talking about housing. Most people's, I don't know, like some 67% of people's wealth is in their homes. My mother, when she died, left me the house. It was worth nothing. A house she purchased the house in the 1950s, I guess. The time that she passed, and anyway, I gave it to Catholic Charities. So I didn't have this equity to pass on to the next generation. We've been denied the ability to accumulate wealth, which of course, hampers our ability to build on the next generation. So these are. I applaud you for doing what you're doing. I mean, you're staying on target with this. You're staying with it, and I'd like to ask you when you do these shows that bring them back to people that the larger issue. They'll pick us apart if we view them just as just little things, health and education or something, but they're a larger part of our status in America. And what can Pittsburghers do? It'd be a great thing to carry this to some of the powers that be in Pittsburgh and say, okay, what can we do? How can we do better in our town? But ultimately, we're going to have better service from the federal government.
And I mean, it's kind of interesting, though, that we're having this conversation, and we may have to continue it because we don't have a lot of time left, but we are in an election year. So if we're going to talk about what can Pittsburgh do, it seems to me that this would be the time to have that conversation, to have at least put the expectation out for conversation, for discussion.
I agree with you. Pittsburgh, as you know now, presently, reports continue to come out that often Pittsburgh is thought to be one of the better cities in America for people, but it's often one of the worst cities in America for black people, and particularly for black women.
Oh, yeah.
This doesn't have to be Pittsburgh. We're not New York. We're a manageable group of people in terms of size, 300,000. We could do better. Pittsburgh could really do better. We really have a shot. We have decent administrators, decent public officials. We have a wealth of top universities. If Pittsburgh put its mind to it, we could be exemplar for the rest of the country.
Indeed. Dr. Larry Davis, Two things. I thank you for joining me in this conversation, but we're not done. We're not done with this conversation. I got to figure out what we do next, but we're not done with this conversation.
Okay.
I appreciate you as always, sir. Thanks so much
Thanks
for
having
joining
me. I
us.
love being on, Lynn. I hope I'm helpful to you. Thank you
Indeed,
very
always. It's that thought process. Thanks so much. We'll take a commercial break. I'll come back and wrap all this up in just a minute. Don't go away.